Welcome to The Shape of Knowing, Episode 1 Metaphors. My name is Jenny. This is a podcast that assembles language, metaphor, learning, and systems to examine how we come to know human behavior and the formation of knowledge. Mostly, this is about, I'm a 51-year-old psychology student about to graduate. I have a 3.96 GPA, and this summer I'm doing a student-designed independent study, writing a theory and metaphor, language and theoretical structure. And I needed a place to ask some deeper questions that I couldn't ask in class, and how it all came together for me, all in my mind. And I needed a place to say them. So here we are. First, a little bit about my background. My earlier college path around 15 years ago, I graduated with an AAS degree in individualized studies with a 4.0 in marketing, media, art, writing, photography, graphic design, videography, journalism, anthropology, and natural disasters, and a whole other amount of broad human subjects. Those classes taught me to pay attention to messages and stories, culture, images, and how people make meaning. This time, college was a little more personal. At the age of 49, I returned with questions about psychology and family, communication, human behavior, and how people understand one another. I was trying to grasp deeper words and look to how the academic world viewed the world for the outcomes I had experienced, and how to look for maybe some answers to what I had already been thinking, experiencing, and had learned through my life, but I had no words for because they were complex. I looked to the material and the professors seriously. I listened closely. I tried to understand each class on its own terms: psychology, development, linguistics, systems, behavior, grief, communication. I let each class teach me what it was trying to teach. Over time, I began noticing that different classes were often talking about related human experiences, but they were just using the same words, same metaphors, but with different assumptions, all kind of rolled in. One class would describe a human process one way. Another class would describe something very similar another way. But they were not always connecting those ideas, and that is what made me wonder. What happens when disciplines divide human experience into separate vocabulary definitions? What do we see more clearly? What do we lose? How much of what we call knowledge is shaped by language we inherit, and from where? So this first episode is about a specific kind of metaphor. The next episode will look more closely at theory formation and how language shapes what we think we know about human beings. So I came to college looking for answers, but what I really found were actual better questions. And those questions had really changed everything for me. I've been thinking deeply about metaphors lately. Well, actually, for a long time. And not metaphors like the ones we all learned in school, like her smile was sunshine, or the world is a stage, or whatever sentence they kind of, involved with metaphor in English class so we could circle the right answer and pass the quiz and kind of move on with our lives. I mean, the metaphors that we actually end up living inside of, the ones we do not even hear anymore because they've become part of the walls that we end up living inside of. The ones we use when we talk about bodies, illness, trauma, morality, family, medicine, psychology, our identity, and even ourselves. Because the more I study psychology, the more I study language, and the more I realize that metaphor is not just language decoration. It is not just poetic flair. It's not just glitter we sprinkle on top of serious thought. Metaphor may be one of the ways serious thought begins to happen. Lakoff and Johnson write in the book Metaphors We Live By that metaphor is not just in language, but in thought and action. Because if metaphor is not just language, then metaphor is not just how we describe reality, it is one of the ways we organize reality. And Max Black, writing earlier in philosophy, gives another piece of this. He argues against the idea that metaphor is just substitution, like one word standing in for another word. He says metaphor works through a system of associated commonplaces. Okay, I know that phrase sounds academic, well, because it is, but I want to slow it down and talk about it how it's more relational language, not academic. So a metaphor does not arrive alone. It brings a whole neighborhood with it. A word carries associations, expectations, cultural habits, shared assumptions, old meanings, emotional tones, social reflexes, things people think they know without checking. So if I call a person broken, I have not just described them, I have dragged in a whole repair shop of a worldview. Like broken things need fixing, broken things may not function, broken things might be defective, broken things may be less useful than unbroken things. Broken things may be thrown away if repair costs too much. Do you see how fast that happens? One word opens a door and suddenly the whole room is furnished. That is metaphor. And this is why I cannot leave it alone and stop thinking about it. Because we use these words like they are harmless. Such as, someone is broken, someone is spiraling, someone fell through the cracks, someone is carrying baggage, someone is toxic, someone is resistant, someone is non-compliant. A child is troubled. A patient is difficult. A woman is dramatic. A survivor is unstable. A person who keeps asking questions is obsessed. A person trying to explain complexity is too much. And we act like these are just descriptions, but are they? Because once you call a child troubled, you've already started to build a theory about the problem, where the problem is located. The problem then is inside the child. It's not in the family, not in the adults, not in the environment, not in the secrets, not in the institution. Then the child becomes the container for the problem. And that is where metaphor starts to do its work. And not because metaphor is bad. I mean, I love metaphor. I think metaphor can be beautiful. It's useful and it is necessary. It lets us reach for things we do not fully understand yet and to reach for that understanding. Science uses metaphor, medicine uses metaphor, psychology uses metaphor. Everyday life would collapse into a boring pile of beige nouns without metaphor. But metaphor does something, and that's the point. It does not just sit there looking pretty. Black says metaphor selects, emphasizes, suppresses, and organizes. That may be one of the most important phrases I think I have read, because that is what I keep seeing. A metaphor selects. It tells us what to notice. It emphasizes, it says, look here, this part matters. And it suppresses. It says, do not look over there. That is not a part of the frame. And then it organizes and arranges what we think we are seeing. So the question is not only what does a metaphor mean? The question is, what does this metaphor do? Okay, so let's take falling through the cracks. Now we say this all the time. A student fell through the cracks. A patient fell through the cracks. A family fell through the cracks. A vulnerable person fell through the cracks. But listen to the metaphor. The person disappears downward. The system becomes a surface. The failure sounds accidental. Oops, they fell through. But who built that floor in the first place? Who designed the cracks? Who knew the cracks were there? Who kept walking across that floor anyway? So falling through the cracks sounds softer than the system failed to hold them. It sounds softer than nobody took responsibility. It sounds softer than this structure was never designed for that person in the first place. This isn't me being dramatic. This is me listening to the architecture inside the phrase. Lakoff and Johnson have a chapter called Highlighting and Hiding. And that is exactly the issue. A metaphor can help us understand one aspect of something while hiding other aspects. And once you see that, you cannot unsee that. Sorry, welcome to the haunted house of metaphors. There are snacks, but the lights might flicker. So let's think about illness as a battle. People say, she is fighting cancer. He lost his battle. She is a warrior. Now, sometimes that metaphor helps people. I'm not here to rip away language that gives someone strength. If someone wants to call themselves a fighter, I am all for it. Use what helps you to survive. But the metaphor still does something. If illness is a battle, then the sick person becomes a fighter. Treatment becomes a weapon, and disease becomes an enemy. The body becomes a battlefield. And then what happens when the person gets tired? What happens when treatment does not work? What happens when the body keeps declining? Did they not fight hard enough? Did they lose? Did they fail? This is how metaphor can smuggle in an entire structure of interpretation into a situation where nobody consciously meant to put it there. And again, I'm not saying people mean harm every time they use these words. Most people are just using language that's available to them and the ones that they know. But language does not need malicious intent to shape perception. And that's the uncomfortable part. And psychology should care about this, because psychology studies perception, cognition, memory, bias, attribution, identity, development, trauma, social behavior, moral reasoning. But underneath all that, there's language. There are categories and labels and metaphor. There are words people use to make another person understandable. And sometimes those words help. Sometimes they open a door. And sometimes they create relief. Sometimes they let a person finally say, yes, that is what this feels like. But sometimes the word becomes a cage. A child is not responding to an environment. They are troubled. They are called troubled. A patient is not medically complex. They can be called difficult. If a person is not protecting themselves, they can be called resistant. A survivor is not responding to harm. They are unstable. A person is not seeing a pattern, they are obsessed. Once that metaphor attaches, everything the person does can get interpreted through it. If people decide you are difficult, even your clarity becomes difficult. If people decide you are dramatic, your pain becomes performance. If people decide you are troubled, your truth becomes evidence against you. That is not just language, that is an interpretive system. And here's where Max Black actually becomes important again. Max Black says that with some metaphors, if you try to translate them into plain language, there is a loss in cognitive content. So, what that means is that metaphor is not just a fancy wrapper around literal thought. Sometimes the metaphor is doing cognitive work that plain paraphrase cannot fully replace. And that is why metaphor is powerful. But it is also why metaphor needs to be examined. Because when a metaphor works, it can feel like understanding, or worse. And sometimes it is understanding, but sometimes it's premature closure, and it's dressed up as some kind of insight. Sometimes a metaphor helps us see, and sometimes a metaphor tells us we are done seeing. And that is the part I keep coming back to, because once people think they understand you, they often stop trying to understand anything. A metaphor becomes a shortcut, and sometimes that shortcut becomes the only road anyone is willing to take. Lakoff and Johnson say something else that matters here. They write that people in power get to impose their metaphors. That sentence should make a lot of people, like psychologists and doctors and teachers, parents, administrators, even AI developers, sit up a little bit straighter, because metaphors are not distributed equally. A person with more authority often gets to choose the frame. A parent gets to call a child troubled. A doctor gets to call a patient anxious. An institution gets to call that person non-compliant. A partner gets to call the other person unstable. A culture gets to call difference deviance. And once the metaphor is chosen, the rest of the story starts organizing around it. That is why I do not think metaphor is innocent. Beautiful in some instances, yes. Useful, yes. Necessary, absolutely. But innocent, no. Metaphor has force, not magic force, not woo-woo force, actual structural force. It can organize. It can organize attention. It can authorize action. It can create expectations. It can make some explanations feel obvious and others feel ridiculous. And it can get inside you. That is the psychological part, because repeated metaphors teach you how to see yourself. If the world keeps telling you that you are broken, difficult, troubled, resistant, too much, unstable, or morally suspicious, eventually those words do not just stay outside of you. They get in you. They become part of your self-interpretation. Then you are not only dealing with what happened, you are dealing with the meaning that was attached to what happened. And that's a different wound. A person can survive an event and still be trapped inside the metaphor other people used to explain that event about that person. And that is what I'm trying to understand. How does metaphor become belief? How does a belief become a self-concept? Then how does a self-concept become a prison for somebody? And how do we know when the language we are using to describe someone is preventing us from seeing them? I think about this with medicine too. Like you can walk into a medical appointment with a whole entire body. You have a medical history, a pattern of symptoms, a timeline, symptoms that may connect in ways you do not even know how to explain yet or at all. And the system needs to separate it, all of it. No. You need GI, you need to go to neurology, autoimmune, pain, stress, anxiety, trauma, one category at a time. And I understand why categories exist. We all need them. Medicine cannot function at all without categories. Psychology cannot function without categories either. But the problem starts when the categories themselves become more real than the person. Because my body does not experience itself in departments. My body does not say, today we are doing GI. Tomorrow we're doing vascular. Thursday we will be neurological. And Friday we'll circle back around to existential dread. The body is happening all at once. The person is happening all at once. But systems often need people to become understandable one piece at a time. Sometimes that helps. Sometimes it destroys the pattern. And there is another metaphor, the pattern. We talk about finding patterns like they're just sitting there waiting to be discovered all around us, just floating. But sometimes we cannot see the pattern because the language we are using has already divided it into pieces. Then the person who keeps saying, no, I think this connects somehow, becomes the difficult one, becomes the complex one, becomes the anxious one. That person becomes the one who is not explaining it correctly. And again, the metaphor starts shaping the interpretation. So then the question is not only what is happening, now the question becomes, why can't you explain this in a way the system accepts? That is a very different question. And people carry that question everywhere. Why can't I explain myself better? Why can't I make them understand? Why do I sound irrational when I tell the truth? Why does my experience become less believable the more complex it gets? This is where metaphor, psychology, and power all meet. Because metaphor does not only describe the world, it can make some worlds easier to enter and others almost impossible to explain. Lakoff and Johnson argue that metaphors can guide action. Max Black argues that metaphors can bring different domains into relation and produce insight. And both are pointing in different ways, but at the same basic problem. Metaphor is active. It does work. It shapes attention. It carries implications. It organizes. It organizes perception. It opens some pathways and closes others. And that is why I think we need better questions. Not just, is this metaphor beautiful? And not just, is this metaphor clever? Or is this metaphor true? The better questions may be, what does this metaphor make visible? What does it hide? What assumptions did it bring with it? Who gets described through it? Who gets protected by it? Who gets blamed by it? Who gets to impose it? Who has to live inside of it? Because maybe someone was not broken. Maybe they were injured. Maybe they were not resistant. Maybe they were protecting themselves. Maybe they were not too much. Maybe the container they were in was too small. Maybe they did not fall through the cracks. Maybe the structure was full of holes. Maybe the problem child was actually the child carrying the evidence. That is the kind of thing I think about. And that is what this podcast is going to be. Not neat answers. I am not a self-help person. Do not anything. This is not pretending I have life figured out, because I absolutely do not. If, you know, this is more like me thinking out loud about the strange machinery underneath ordinary words that we use from person to person. And psychology gives me one set of tools, and language gives me another. Life gives me material I did not exactly request, but here we are. And then somewhere between them all, I keep finding questions I can't leave alone that I'm not finding clear answers to yet. So today the question is metaphor, not metaphor as decoration, not metaphor as poetry alone, but metaphor as a structure, metaphor as attention, metaphor as interpretation, metaphor as the system of assumptions that walks in with a word, metaphor as a way of making people legible, and sometimes metaphor as the room people are forced to live inside. So maybe the question is not just, what does this metaphor mean? Maybe the better question is, what does this metaphor do? What does it make people believe? What does it allow people to ignore? What actions does it authorize? And who has to live with the consequences? This is what I'm thinking about today. Because sometimes the metaphor is not just naming the pattern. Sometimes the metaphor is the pattern. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Until next time, this is Jen on The Shape of Knowing. And don't forget to subscribe for my next episodes that are coming up. I have a couple more, so subscribe and like or whatever you do on here. Thank you.